4 nurses ran through the iron gates of the Kane mansion as if escaping a war zone. The first one was sobbing so hard she tripped over her own feet, her suitcase flying open and scattering scrubs across the gravel. The second one walked in complete silence, eyes hollow and empty like she had just witnessed something that broke her soul. The third one was already on the phone with her lawyer, screaming about hazard pay and psychological damages. The fourth one, a tall man built like a soldier who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, stopped in the middle of the driveway, looked back at the Gothic mansion looming behind him, and whispered that thing in there is not human. He is the devil himself, then crossed himself and ran. Grace Bennett walked past all of them with a worn backpack over her shoulder, shoes with holes she had covered with duct tape, and the calm expression of someone who had already seen hell and survived it. She glanced at the chaos around her and muttered that people really need to learn how to handle pressure as she adjusted the strap digging into her shoulder. The mansion rose before her like something out of a horror movie, all black stone and pointed spires and gargoyles that seemed to watch her every step. Armed guards stood at every corner, hands resting on holstered weapons, eyes tracking her movement with cold suspicion. Grace thought to herself that if she died here, nobody would even notice she was gone. The head housekeeper, a woman named Elena Russo who looked like she had buried more bodies than a cemetery groundskeeper, stood at the massive oak entrance with a clipboard and the exhausted expression of someone who had given up on hope long ago. Elena looked Grace up and down, taking in the threadbare clothes, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she stood like someone ready to either fight or collapse, and asked if she was the new nurse from the agency. Grace nodded and said that was her, Grace Bennett, ready for duty, and extended her hand with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Elena did not shake it. Instead, she asked if Grace had read the contract. Grace said she had. Elena asked if she had read the whole contract, including the fine print about not holding the Kane family liable for physical injury, psychological trauma, emotional distress, or death. Grace raised an eyebrow and said she particularly enjoyed the part about death, very reassuring. Elena let out a long breath and said to listen carefully, because Dominic Kane was complicated. Grace asked if he was complicated like complaining about thread count or complicated like throwing furniture. Elena answered that he was complicated like 23 medical professionals in 6 months, and that did not count the ones who quit before their first shift ended. Grace blinked and said that was almost impressive, like some kind of world record for being impossible. Elena said this was not a joke. Grace replied that she knew, but if she did not laugh, she would cry, and she had already cried enough for one lifetime. Besides, her mascara was not waterproof, and she only had 1 tube left and could not afford another one. If you love stories about impossible love, unforgettable characters, and second chances, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs a good story, and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Now let us see what happens when a broken girl meets the devil himself. Elena turned and began walking without checking whether Grace was keeping up, her footsteps striking the black marble floor like the ticking of a countdown clock, while Grace followed, forcing herself not to let her jaw drop as she took in her surroundings. The entrance hall of the Kane estate larger than the entire apartment she once shared with Marcus, its ceiling soaring at least 15 meters high, a massive chandelier hanging above like a monster made of crystal and gold, enormous oil paintings lining the walls, each one depicting a man with ice-cold eyes and an expression that seemed to judge every step she took, Grace recognizing them as portraits of generations of the Kane family, and not a single one looking like a man who knew how to smile. Elena leading her down a corridor that felt endless, the floor polished so perfectly that Grace could see her own reflection beneath her feet. Every few meters, a bodyguard standing motionless like a statue, eyes fixed forward, yet Grace, knowing they were tracking her every movement, wondering how many people had been dragged out of this hallway and never seen again. Elena stopping abruptly before a spiral staircase of black oak, its railing carved with images that took Grace a moment to recognize as hunting scenes, wolves tearing into their prey. How tasteful, Grace muttered, Elena glancing at her and explaining that Dominic Kane's grandfather had commissioned the staircase after killing his first enemy, as a reminder to anyone entering the house that they were standing in a predator's territory. Grace swallowing hard but keeping her voice steady as she asked whether there was an elevator because she was a little afraid of heights. Elena not smiling and starting up the stairs, passing the 2nd floor with its closed doors, then the 3rd floor, where Grace caught a glimpse through a half-open door of a vast library with thousands of books stacked from floor to ceiling, until they finally stopped on the 4th floor in the east wing, before a pair of carved wooden doors nearly 3 meters tall. Elena turning back to Grace with a look she could not read, half pity and half respect, saying that before she went in there were a few things she needed to know. Dominic Kane had not left this room in 3 months. He had refused light, refused people, refused even the act of living. He had a wound to his shoulder and ribs from 3 weeks earlier that had become severely infected because he would not allow anyone to treat it. Dr. Tommy Chen, the only person permitted to come near him, had said that if this continued he would be dead within a few weeks. Grace asking why he refused to be treated, Elena falling silent for a moment before saying it was because he did not want to be saved. He wanted to die but was too proud to end it himself. A chill running down Grace's spine, not from fear but from recognition, because she understood that feeling, having once stood on a bridge at 3 a.m, after Marcus died, and wondered whether the water would be cold. Elena, continuing that Dominic's father, Victor Kane, was dying of heart disease, that he had hired Grace at a salary 5 times the market rate, not because he believed she could heal his son, but because he had run out of hope and only wanted to try one last time before both father and son were gone. Grace asking whether that was encouragement or a warning. Elena replying that it was the truth, and that in this house truth was a rare luxury, so she should value it, then placing her hand on the door handle and saying that once Grace stepped inside, she would not be meeting a patient, but a wounded beast, and there was nothing more dangerous than a wounded beast that wanted to die. Asking one final time whether Grace wished to turn back, because once this door opened, there was no retreat. Grace looking at the towering doors before her, and then down at her torn shoes, thinking of the battered old car parked outside, of the $200,000 of debt crushing her shoulders, of nights spent sleeping in that car with an empty stomach and bone deep cold, realizing she had not had a way back for a long time, taking a deep breath and saying she was ready and that Elena should open the door. Elena pushed the door open, and darkness spilled out like a living entity. Grace stepping inside and needing several seconds for her eyes to adjust to the near absence of light, heavy black velvet curtains sealing every window, while only the faint fire in the corner fireplace cast a weak glow that sent ghost-like shadows dancing along the walls, the smell of whiskey mixed with antiseptic, and the stale scent of a man who had not left this room in far too long flooding her senses, the room as large as a small apartment with a massive black carved king-size bed, a desk cluttered with papers and liquor bottles, and dark paintings. Grace did not want to study too closely, then she heard the door close behind her and realized Elena was gone, leaving her alone in the devil's lair. And then she saw him. Dominic Kane not lying in bed as she had expected, but seated in a leather armchair by the fire, his back straight like a king even as he was dying, wearing a black shirt unbuttoned at the top to reveal white bandages wrapped around his shoulder and chest, soaked through with blood and yellow fluid, his face so pale it was nearly gray, sweat beading on his brow, yet his black eyes sharp as razors as they locked onto her, Grace having seen many patients in her life, the ones who screamed, the ones who begged, the ones who had given up, but never anyone who looked at her as if she were an insect meant to be crushed. Dominic saying nothing for a long moment as his gaze traveled over her tangled, uncombed hair, her worn clothes, her shoes held together with tape, and her battered backpack like discarded trash. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and cold like the bottom of a lake in winter, as he told her to get out. Grace blinking and asking what he had just said, Dominic not repeating himself but stating she had 30 seconds to return to that door and disappear from his house before he called someone to drag her out. Grace not moving, standing there with her arms hanging at her sides and meeting the hell-dark eyes of the most dangerous man she had ever encountered, saying she was the nurse hired to care for him. Dominic giving a humorless laugh, dry and empty, saying he did not need a nurse, did not need a doctor, did not need anyone, and especially did not need a girl who looked like she had just been thrown out of a shelter, the words cutting into Grace's chest like a blade, but cruelty being something she knew well because she had grown up with it, telling him that maybe he was right, that she looked like trash. But trash was not afraid of being thrown away, and she was here to do her job. Dominic tilting his head, eyes narrowing dangerously, as he asked if she knew who he was, Grace answering that she did, that he was Dominic Kane, the man people called the devil, that he ran an empire she did not want to know the details of, and that he could make her disappear without anyone ever finding her body, then adding that she also knew he was burning with fever, that his wounds were severely infected, and that without proper treatment in the coming weeks he would die. So did he want to spend his 30 seconds throwing her out, or letting her change those foul-smelling bandages, Dominic rising from the chair, and Grace realizing he was taller than she had imagined, at least 1.85 meters, broad-shouldered, the build of a man who had once been very strong before illness had carved him down, stepping toward her with every movement radiating threat. even as he clearly fought the pain tearing through his right shoulder, stopping directly in front of her, close enough for Grace to feel the unnatural heat of his fevered body, murmuring that he had killed people for far smaller offenses than daring to talk back to him. Grace lifting her gaze, neck tilted back because of the height difference yet not retreating a single step, telling him she believed he had killed people. Also telling him she had been beaten by her own father for 8 years, had lived in an orphanage where older children burned her belongings for fun, had buried her husband 1 year ago, and was currently living in her car because she could not afford rent, looking straight into his eyes and saying he could kill her if he wished, but he could not frighten her because she had been afraid enough for an entire lifetime, and she had nothing left to lose. Dominic looked at her as if she had just grown a second head, because no one, absolutely no one, had ever spoken to him that way, and lived to tell the story. Then he turned and walked to the desk, picked up the phone and said only 2 words, "Marco, come up here." Less than a minute later the door opened and a man as big as a bear appeared. Marco Santini stood nearly 1.90 meters tall, shoulders as wide as a doorway, his face carved with scars, and his hands as large as shovels. He looked at Grace and then at Dominic with a question in his eyes that needed no words. Dominic nodded toward her and said, "Throw her out." Marco moved toward Grace, each step making the floor seem to tremble. Grace did not run and did not retreat. She simply stood there and watched the giant approaching her. And when Marco was close enough to grab her, Grace suddenly spoke and said that before he threw her out, she had a question. Marco stopped not because of the question itself, but because of the strange calm in her voice. Dominic was watching too, his black eyes narrowing with a curiosity he could not fully hide. Grace asked why a man as powerful as Dominic Kane, a man who could buy an entire hospital if he wanted to, would choose to die slowly in a dark room instead of putting a bullet in his head and being done with it. She went on to say that was not the way of someone who truly wanted to die. It was the way of someone punishing himself. The room fell so silent, Grace could hear the fire crackling in the fireplace. Marco stood frozen, glancing at his boss, waiting for orders. Dominic said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and Grace knew she had touched a wound far deeper than the one in his shoulder. She continued that she did not know what he had done, or why he believed he deserved to die, but she knew that look because she had seen it in the mirror for an entire year after her husband died. She told him that Marcus had begged her not to borrow money for his treatment, that he wanted to go gently, but she refused to listen. She borrowed $200,000, sold everything she could sell, forced him to endure 8 more months of chemotherapy from hell, only for him to die in agony anyway. And every day she wondered whether she had prolonged his suffering out of selfishness or out of love, and she never found an answer. Grace looked straight into Dominic's eyes and said that 1 week after the funeral she had stood on the Brooklyn Bridge at 3 a.m, stared down at the black water below, and wondered if it was cold, that she did not jump not because she wanted to live but because she still owed money and did not want that debt to become anyone else's burden. She said she understood wanting to die, and she also understood being unable to die. Marco was now looking at her completely differently, no longer like an executioner eyeing his prey, but like a man seeing something he never expected to see. Dominic remained silent but had sat down on the edge of the desk, his eyes never leaving Grace, and finally he asked why she was telling him all this. Grace answered that she wanted him to know she was not a naive nurse who had come here hoping to save someone, that she came because she needed money, and because she had nowhere else to go, that she was not afraid of him killing her because honestly there were days she wished someone would do it for her. But she would still do her job because it was the only thing she knew how to do anymore. Dominic stared at her for so long, Grace began to wonder if he intended to freeze that way forever. Then he signaled to Marco and told him to leave. Marco nodded and exited the room without a word, closing the door behind him. Dominic stood and walked slowly toward Grace, each step radiating pain he was trying to conceal, stopping an arm's length away and saying 1 week. Grace asked what he meant. Dominic said she had 1 week to prove she was not an annoyance, that if during that week she bothered him, asked stupid questions, tried to lecture him about morality, or worse, showed him pity, she would be gone faster than all the others before her. Grace asked what would happen if she made it through the week. Dominic tilted his head and said no one ever had, so he had not thought about it. Grace held out her hand and said, then they had a deal. Dominic looked at her hand as if it were a venomous snake, but finally took it, his hand twice the size of hers, burning hot with fever and trembling slightly in a way an ordinary person would not notice. But Grace was not ordinary, and she did notice. And she realized that the devil everyone feared was in truth just a man in so much pain he could no longer bear it, using cruelty as armor, so no one would ever see that pain. The next morning, Grace was awakened at 5 o'clock by a knock on the door of the small room Elena had arranged for her at the far end of the fourth-floor corridor. She opened it to find Marco standing there, holding a thick envelope. He handed it to her without a word and turned away, his heavy footsteps echoing down the silent hallway. Grace opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers at least 15 pages thick. The top of the first page bearing a bold printed title that read, "Rules for Medical Staff Assigned to Dominic Kane." She sat on the edge of the bed and began to read. Rule number 1 stated that lights were not to be turned on unless explicitly permitted, and that natural light was also forbidden. Therefore, the curtains were not to be touched under any circumstances. Rule number 2 stated that she was not to speak unless directly addressed, and that her answers must be brief and contain no more than 10 words. Rule number 3 stated that she was not to make direct eye contact for longer than 3 seconds. Rule number 4 stated that she was not to touch the patient without first clearly stating exactly what she intended to do and receiving verbal consent. Rule number 5 stated that medication must be placed on the table beside the bed at a distance of exactly 90 centimeters from the head of the bed, with the label facing outward at a 45-degree angle to the edge of the table. Grace paused at this rule and wondered whether he actually measured the angle with a protractor. She continued reading. Rule number 6 stated that water must be served at an exact temperature of 18 degrees Celsius, with no deviation. Rule number 7 stated that no mobile phone was permitted inside the room. Rule number 8 stated that white clothing was forbidden because it was too bright. Rule number 9 stated that red clothing was forbidden for personal reasons. Rule number 10 stated that no perfume or scented cosmetics of any kind were allowed. The list continued through 11, 12, 13, until rule number 37 stated that one must not breathe too loudly when standing within a radius of 2 meters. Grace finished reading and sat still for a long moment. Then she laughed, a dry rasping sound filling the small room, telling herself, "All right, the game begins." At 6 in the morning, Grace appeared at Dominic's door carrying a tray of medication and wearing a light gray outfit because the list did not prohibit gray. She knocked 3 times as required by rule number 23 and waited. A voice from inside granted permission to enter. She pushed the door open with her shoulder because rule number 19 stated that the left hand was not to be used to open doors. The room was still pitch dark, but this time she was prepared and did not stumble over anything. Dominic sat in his familiar leather chair by the fireplace, eyes tracking her like a hawk watching prey. Grace stepped to the table beside the bed and set the tray down. She pulled a measuring tape from her pocket and measured exactly 90 centimeters from the head of the bed, adjusting the tray accordingly. Then she took out a protractor she had borrowed from Elena and placed it beside the medicine box, rotating the label until it reached precisely 45 degrees. She straightened and said with complete seriousness that the medication had been placed according to specifications, sir, and asked whether she should bring a laser alignment device next time for greater accuracy. Dominic said nothing, but one eyebrow lifted slightly. Grace continued that she had also checked the water temperature with a calibrated thermometer, and it was exactly 18 degrees Celsius as requested. However, she felt obliged to warn him that within 3 minutes the temperature would drop by approximately 0.5 degrees due to the ambient room temperature. So if he wished to drink it at exactly 18 degrees, he had approximately 180 seconds from now. Dominic still said nothing, but she could swear the corner of his mouth twitched. She added that she had also noted that rule number 2 stated she was not to speak more than 10 words, but did not specify whether that meant 10 words per sentence or 10 words per day. So for the moment she was interpreting it as 10 words per sentence, and would count carefully from now on. Dominic finally spoke and asked whether she was mocking him. Grace replied that she would never dare, and that she was merely following the rules he himself had established with strict precision, since he had clearly invested a great deal of time and effort into creating such an impressively detailed list. She added that she was particularly impressed by rule number 32 regarding not coughing more than twice consecutively, which demonstrated an admirable attention to detail. Dominic rose from his chair and walked toward her, each step deliberate like a panther approaching its prey. He stopped directly in front of her and looked down with eyes she could not read. He said that 23 people before her had either run away or cried or begged upon reading that list. Grace looked up at him and replied that those 23 people had clearly never had to read the regulations of the public hospital where she once worked, because compared to those rules, his list resembled a kindergarten instruction manual. She added that she would also like to point out a minor flaw in rule number 15, which stated that no food was allowed in the room but failed to define what constituted food. Therefore, technically, she could bring in an apple, since an apple was fruit and not food under certain definitions. Dominic stared at her in silence for a few seconds, and then did something that Marco would later say had not happened in 3 years. He let out a short, dry chuckle, not warm or friendly, but sharp and mechanical, like a rusted machine struggling to remember how it functioned. He said, "Very well, little nurse. If she wanted to play this game, then they would play." And he was curious to see how long she would keep smiling. Grace smiled back and said she was curious too, and now, with his permission, she needed to change the dressing on his wound because in her observation, it was seeping through his shirt, which indicated a more severe infection than she had initially thought. The game could wait, but the wound could not. On the first night, Dominic called for her at 2 a.m. On the second night, it was 3. And on the third night, he waited until 4:15 as if testing which hour might finally break her, and every time Grace woke, dressed carefully within the strict color rules, and appeared at his door within 5 minutes. And on the third night, when she entered, he was sitting on the bed like a man who had not slept at all, his deep black eyes tracking her in the darkness. He said he wanted water. Grace answered that was fine, and asked whether he wanted the usual 18 degrees, or if tonight he wished to experiment with 17 for a change. Dominic ignored the question and said he also wanted pain medication. Grace nodded and went to prepare it, returning with a silver tray holding a glass of water measured to the exact temperature and medication arranged perfectly according to the absurd specifications he demanded. She placed the tray on the table beside the bed and measured the 90-centimeter distance as always. And as she straightened, Dominic swept his hand out and knocked the tray to the floor, metal clanging sharply against wood in the silent night. Water spilling across the floor and pills scattering everywhere. Grace looked down at the mess, and then at Dominic, who watched her with an icy, detached gaze, waiting for her reaction like a scientist observing a laboratory rat. But she did not scream or cry or turn away. She silently knelt, picked up each pill one by one, wiped the floor with the cloth she always carried in her pocket, and cleaned the mess. And when she finished, she said calmly that she would return with a new tray. She left and came back 10 minutes later with fresh water and medication, placed the tray down, measured the distance, adjusted the label angle, and Dominic knocked it down again. Grace cleaned it up without a word. The third time he did the same, and the fourth as well. And on the fifth time, as Grace bent to gather the pills scattered across the floor, she paused and said without looking up that her father used to throw dinner plates against the wall every night when he was drunk, and she had to pick up every shard, every grain of rice, every scrap of food while he stood there hurling insults, that she did it for 8 years, until her hands hardened from broken porcelain, and her heart hardened from words. Then she looked up at Dominic and said he could throw this tray down 100 times and she would pick it up 100 times because this was her job, and she had done far worse things than picking up pills at 4 a.m, and she added that she wondered whether he truly wanted her gone, or whether he was simply trying to see if there was anyone in the world patient enough to stay with him. Dominic said nothing, only watched her in the darkness with unreadable black eyes. Grace stood with the pills in her hand and said she would get another tray, and that this time she hoped he would leave it alone because pain medication was not cheap and she hated waste. She turned toward the door, when Dominic's voice stopped her and told her to wait. She paused without turning around. Heard the rustle of sheets, slow, heavy footsteps. Then the sound of Dominic bending to pick something up from the floor, and when she turned, she saw him standing there holding the silver tray he himself had knocked down minutes earlier, placing it back on the table without looking at her and telling her to get new medication. Grace looked at him, at the tray he had lifted with his own hands, and understood that this was the closest thing to an apology she would ever receive from Dominic Kane. She nodded and said she would return in 5 minutes, and when she stepped out and the door closed behind her, she allowed herself to smile for the first time since arriving in this house, not because she had won, but because she realized that beneath the devil's armor, beneath the cruelty and coldness, there was still a man capable of feeling something no matter how fiercely he tried to hide it. And when she returned with the new tray, Dominic took the medication without complaint, and when she left, he did not say thank you, because of course he never would. But he did not knock the tray to the floor again. And for Grace, that was a small victory in the long battle she knew still lay ahead. On the 5th night, everything changed. Grace was lying on her bed in the small room when at 1 a.m. she heard strange sounds drifting from the far end of the hallway. Not the familiar call bell, but moaning, the sound of something striking against furniture, and fragmented, incoherent speech. She jumped up without even putting on a jacket and ran toward Dominic's room. And when she pushed the door open, the sight before her froze her for a second. Dominic was lying on the floor beside the bed, one leg still tangled in the blanket, as if he had tried to stand and failed. Sweat soaked his forehead. His shirt clung wetly to his body, and his black eyes were wide open yet seeing nothing at all. He was delirious. Grace rushed to him and placed her hand on his forehead. His skin burned like fire. She estimated at least 40 degrees or more. She called his name, but he did not respond. Instead, he began to speak in broken, indistinct phrases, and then she heard a name repeated again and again like a desperate prayer. Luca. He kept calling Luca, his voice trembling with such raw pain that Grace felt as if her heart were being crushed. He said he was sorry, Luca. He was sorry. Please do not go. Please do not leave. Grace did not know who Luca was, but she knew that sound. She knew the sound of a heart breaking because she herself had made that sound when Marcus took his last breath in her arms. There was no time to think. She ran to the bathroom, grabbed wet towels, and began cooling his forehead and neck. She called Tommy Chen, the family's private doctor, and he arrived within 20 minutes carrying his medical bag. Tommy administered fever, reducing medication, and high-dose antibiotics, while Grace kept changing the compresses. Tommy said the wound was far more severely infected than he had thought, and that if Dominic continued to refuse proper treatment, he would not survive the month. Grace asked why he was destroying himself like this. Tommy was silent for a moment before saying it was not his story to tell, but that it involved Luca, Dominic's younger brother and also Tommy's closest friend. He added that Luca had died 3 years earlier, and that Dominic had never forgiven himself. Tommy left at 4 a.m. once the fever had dropped to 38 degrees, instructing Grace to monitor him through the night and call immediately if anything changed. Grace pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. Dominic remained unconscious, occasionally mumbling words she could not make out. She watched his face in the faint firelight and realized that without the cold mask he wore when awake, he looked entirely different, like a man utterly exhausted, in pain, and lonely to the bone. Suddenly, Dominic's hand reached out and closed around hers. She startled but did not pull away. His hand was hot and trembling, gripping her as if she were the last lifeline in an open sea. He called Luca's name again and said, "Do not go. I am sorry. I should have saved you." Grace did not know Luca, did not know what had happened, but she did the only thing she could. She tightened her grip and spoke softly, telling him she was here. She was not going anywhere. He was not alone. She did not know whether he heard her, but slowly his grip loosened, and his breathing grew steadier. She stayed there all night, her hand never leaving his, her eyes never leaving his face, as it gradually softened into sleep. She did not notice when she herself slumped forward beside the bed, her head resting against the mattress, her hand still holding his. And when Dominic woke at the first pale light of dawn slipping through a narrow gap in the curtains, the first thing he saw was Grace asleep beside his bed, her hair fallen messily across her face, dark circles beneath her eyes, her small hand still clasping his as if afraid he might disappear. He watched her for a long time without speaking or moving, and then instead of pulling his hand away as he should have, Dominic Kane, the devil everyone feared, simply lay there and let her keep holding his hand in the quiet, fragile light of early morning. Grace woke with a stiff, aching neck and realized she was still sitting beside Dominic's bed. She startled upright and found him watching her with eyes that were fully awake. She did not know how long he had been conscious, or how long he had been watching her sleep, but the thought sent a strange tightness through her chest. She pulled her hand free from his and stood up too quickly, nearly knocking the chair over, stammering an apology and saying she had not meant to fall asleep like that, and that she would check his temperature and change the bandages right away. Dominic said nothing, only continued to watch her with an expression she could not read. Grace took the thermometer and measured 37.5. The fever had dropped significantly. She let out a quiet breath of relief and began preparing the supplies, working in silence as she removed the old bandages soaked with discharge, cleaned the wound now showing signs of improvement from the high-dose antibiotics, and applied fresh dressings. Throughout it all, Dominic did not groan or flinch even though she knew it had to hurt. When she finished and was putting the instruments away, his low voice asked whether she had sat there all night. Grace nodded without looking at him, and replied that Dr. Tommy had instructed her to monitor him. Dominic was quiet for a moment and then asked why. Grace paused and turned to face him. Asking why what? Dominic said why she stayed, why she held his hand. He had not paid her to do those things. Grace looked at him, and in his deep black eyes, she saw not the familiar coldness but genuine confusion, as if he truly could not understand why anyone would do something kind for him without an agenda. She answered that he had been calling someone's name in his delirium, and she could not leave when someone was in that much pain. Dominic turned his face away toward the window still sealed by heavy curtains, silence stretching between them. Then he said, Luca. Grace asked gently who Luca was. Dominic still did not look at her as he replied that Luca was his younger brother. She waited, did not press, did not force him, simply stood there and waited the way she had waited beside Marcus's hospital bed for 8 long months. Dominic finally added that Luca was dead and that it was his fault. His voice did not tremble or break. It was flat like the surface of a frozen lake, hiding an ocean of pain beneath. Grace did not offer hollow reassurances like it was not your fault or everything will be fine. Instead, she sat down on the chair beside the bed and said that her husband's name was Marcus. Dominic turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Grace continued, her voice soft but steady, saying that he already knew the facts of her story, about the debt and the chemotherapy, but facts were not the same as feelings. She looked down at her hands and confessed that Marcus had forgiven her before he took his last breath, but she had never been able to forgive herself. She told him that keeping someone alive when they wanted to go wasn't an act of heroism, it was an act of selfish desperation, and she lived with that ghost every single day. She looked up at Dominic and said she did not know the details of what had happened to Luca, but she knew exactly what it felt like to look into a mirror and see a killer staring back. She knew what it was like to lie awake every night wondering whether she had done the right thing, or had selfishly prolonged the suffering of the person she loved. Dominic watched her, and for the first time since they had met, she did not see coldness or contempt in his gaze. She saw recognition, the understanding of one scarred soul looking at another. He did not speak, did not offer comfort or apology. He only nodded slowly as if to say that he understood, and to Grace that was worth more than 1,000 words. She stood and said she would go get his breakfast, and as she reached the door, Dominic's voice sounded behind her calling her name. Grace turned back. He looked at her for a long moment and then said thank you. Only 2 simple words, but she knew that for Dominic Kane, they were a mountain he had to climb to say them. She smiled softly and replied that it was nothing, then stepped out, her heart racing for a reason she did not dare to admit. The second week began with an uninvited guest. Grace was in Dominic's room preparing to change the morning bandages when the door flew open without a knock. A woman entered as if she owned the room itself, tall with platinum blonde hair cut to her shoulders, ice blue eyes, and a tight red dress that cost more than Grace earned in 5 years. 2 massive bodyguards followed and stopped at the doorway, with Marco trailing behind them looking tense, as though he had been unable to stop her. Dominic was seated in his armchair and did not rise to greet her. He merely looked at the woman with cold eyes and asked Natasha, who had given her permission to come in. The woman smiled, her laugh clear like a bell yet sharp as a blade, and replied that she was Natasha Volkov and she needed no one's permission. She moved closer to Dominic, hips swaying like a snake sliding toward its prey, and sat on the edge of the chair opposite him, without being invited. She said she had heard he was injured, and had come out of concern, and that her father also wished to discuss the alliance proposal he had sent the previous month. Grace stood beside the table holding her medical kit, uncertain whether she should stay or leave, then decided to continue her work and stepped toward Dominic to change the bandages as planned. Only then did Natasha turn to look at her as if she had just noticed her existence. Blue eyes sweeping Grace from head to toe, taking in the hastily tied hair, the plain nursing uniform, the worn shoes, with undisguised contempt. Natasha asked Dominic what this was in a tone one might use to point out a stain on a rug. Dominic did not answer, only watched Natasha with an unreadable expression. Grace calmly replied instead that she was Mr. Kane's nurse, and she was doing her job, so if Ms. Volkov did not mind, she needed to change the patient's bandages. Natasha scoffed and said, "Oh, it talks," then turned to Dominic and asked, since when he allowed servants to speak when guests were present. Grace felt heat rush to her face, but held it back and continued opening her kit, saying evenly that she was medical staff, not a servant, and she was caring for a patient with a severe infection, so discussions of alliances or anything else could wait until she was finished. Natasha sprang to her feet, blue eyes blazing, stepping directly in front of Grace, and speaking slowly as if addressing a child, saying she did not know who the girl was or which gutter she had crawled out of, but she was Natasha Volkov, daughter of Viktor Volkov, and in this world people like the girl did not get to look people like her in the eye, let alone talk back. Grace did not step back. She met the icy blue gaze and replied that she knew exactly who Natasha was. The entire underworld knew the Volkov family, but in this room she was responsible for the patient's health, and whether Miss Volkov was a Russian princess or the Queen of Hell, she would still do her job. Natasha opened her mouth to speak, but Dominic's voice cut through the room, telling Natasha to sit down and let her work. Natasha stared at him in shock as if she could not believe what she had heard, asking what he had just told her to do. Dominic did not repeat himself, only held her with eyes cold as ice until Natasha reluctantly returned to her chair and sat. Grace proceeded to change Dominic's bandages, her hands steady, even as her heart pounded wildly. She could feel Natasha's gaze burning into her back the entire time. When she finished and packed away her tools, Natasha spoke in a voice so sweet it was dangerous, saying the little nurse was interesting Dominic, and she could see why he kept her around, but she hoped he remembered that there were things more important than temporary amusement, and that her father's alliance proposal was still awaiting an answer. Grace left the room without looking back, but just before she closed the door she heard Natasha add something in Russian, words Grace did not understand but whose tone was unmistakably a threat. And as the door shut, Grace knew she had just made an enemy more dangerous than any she had faced before, and in the world Dominic Kane inhabited, enemies did not merely hate you, they wanted you to disappear. 3 nights after the encounter with Natasha, Grace woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of bottles clinking and something shattering from Dominic's room. She rushed down the hall and pushed the door open to find him sitting on the floor beside the fireplace, his back against the leg of the armchair. Empty whiskey bottles scattered around him, and a broken glass lying near the table. Firelight illuminating his face, his black eyes bloodshot and hollow as if staring into nothingness. Grace entered and sat down beside him without asking questions or passing judgment, simply sitting there in silence. A long stretch of time passed before Dominic finally spoke, his voice rough and thick with alcohol, saying that today was Luca's birthday, 31 years old, if he were still alive. Grace said nothing and listened. Dominic lifted a half-full bottle and drank straight from it, saying that Luca had been the different one in the Kane family, the only light in a lineage filled with darkness, that from childhood he hated violence, hated guns, hated everything the family stood for, that he wanted to be a doctor, wanted to save lives instead of taking them. Dominic let out a bitter laugh and said their father had opposed it, wanted Luca to follow the family path, but Dominic had protected his brother, had fought even their father so Luca could go to medical school, that Luca graduated from Columbia Medical School with nearly perfect scores and began his residency at a public hospital serving the poor, that he refused prestigious hospitals and refused family money, wanting to build his own life. Dominic said he was proud of Luca, so proud that every time he saw him in a white coat he felt that maybe the Kane family was not entirely darkness. Then Dominic's voice dropped, growing darker, as he told her that 3 years earlier a gang from Chicago had tried to expand into New York. Knowing they could not confront the Kane family directly, so they struck at a weakness, kidnapping Luca as he was leaving the hospital after a night shift. Dominic paused, his hand tightening around the bottle until his knuckles went white, saying they called him and demanded that he withdraw from 3 Brooklyn districts and pay a $5 million ransom. That he could pay it, $5 million meant nothing to him. But if he paid, if he gave in front of every other gang, the Kane family would be seen as weak, and there would be more kidnappings, more attacks, that he was the leader, and had to think of the bigger picture. Grace felt the blood drain cold through her veins, as she understood where the story was headed. Dominic said he refused to negotiate, that he sent people to search for Luca, tried every way to rescue him, but refused to pay the ransom, refused to show weakness, believing he could save his brother another way, believing he was smarter than them, believing he could have both, and he was wrong. His voice breaking as he said that 3 days later a wooden crate was delivered to his door. Inside was Luca, his younger brother, the baby he had held when he was born, the child he had sworn to protect at any cost, that they tortured Luca for 3 days, did things Dominic could not put into words, and that the last thing Luca likely saw before he died was the disappointment of realizing that the brother he trusted had not come to save him. Dominic hurled the whiskey bottle into the fireplace, glass shattering as flames roared, and said in a voice strangled with pain that he had killed his brother, that he and his arrogance, he and the damned honor of the Kane family had done it, that he could have paid, could have yielded, could have done anything and Luca would still be alive. But instead he chose pride over his brother's life. He looked at Grace with blood-red eyes and said that was why he did not want to be saved, why he did not deserve to live, that this wound, this infection was the punishment he deserved, that he had killed Luca, and a slow, painful death was the least he could do to atone. Grace sat there with tears running down her face, without realizing when they had begun. She said nothing because there were no words capable of easing such pain. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She moved closer and placed her hand over his, letting him know he was not alone in the darkness. letting him know that someone was here and would not leave. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound in the room, the soft crackle of the fire in the fireplace. Dominic still staring into the flames with eyes as empty as someone who had lost everything. Grace, knowing she should say something, yet understanding that no words could possibly ease the weight of pain he carried. And then she realized that perhaps he did not need comfort, perhaps he needed to know that he was not the only person in the world drowning in guilt. She took a deep breath and began to speak, telling him that when Marcus was diagnosed with terminal cancer, the doctors told them he had roughly 3 to 6 months left without treatment, and perhaps a little longer with chemotherapy. Though survival was almost impossible, Marcus wanted to stop. He told her he did not want to go through the hell of chemotherapy just to gain a few more months of suffering, that he wanted to live whatever time remained, to love her, to leave this world in peace. But she did not listen. Grace paused, her voice trembling slightly as she continued, saying she could not accept losing him, could not sit still and watch the person she loved fade away without doing something, so she borrowed money from banks, from finance companies, from anywhere that would lend to her. $200,000 poured into treating a man who did not want to be treated. She forced Marcus to undergo chemotherapy, to take expensive experimental drugs, to endure pain she could not begin to imagine. And for 8 months, 8 long months, she watched him wither day by day, his hair falling out, his weight dropping from 75 kilograms to 40, his skin turning gray like ash. There were nights when he hurt so badly that he cried and begged her to let him die. Yet she still would not let go because she believed her love was strong enough to save him, because she believed that if she tried hard enough, a miracle would happen. Grace wiped the tears running down her cheeks and said the miracle never came. Marcus died in the hospital at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, with only her beside him, and the last thing he said to her before closing his eyes was that he forgave her. He forgave her, the woman who had forced him to endure 8 months of hell instead of 6 months of peace. He forgave her, but she had never been able to forgive herself. Dominic turned to look at her for the first time since she began speaking, his black eyes no longer empty but holding something like understanding. Grace met his gaze and said she did not know whether she had done right or wrong. There were days when she believed she had fought for love and done everything possible to save the person she loved, but there were nights when she woke at 3 a.m. and wondered whether she had prolonged his suffering out of love or out of selfish terror at being alone. She went on to say that she understood why Dominic wanted to die. She understood the feeling of looking into a mirror and seeing a killer stare back. She understood the temptation to punish oneself, to believe that if the pain was great enough, the guilt might be erased. But she also knew something it had taken her, a year of standing on the Brooklyn Bridge night after night, to understand that death was not atonement. Death was escape. That if Dominic died, the pain would not disappear. It would simply pass to others, to his father, to the people who still needed him, and that Luca, who had spent his life saving others, would never want his brother to die in order to atone for his death. Dominic said nothing, only watched her in the firelight, and then he did something that left Grace frozen. He lifted his hand and touched her face, his fingers brushing away the tear sliding down her cheek. A small gesture, a brief moment, yet it spoke more than 1,000 words. Grace covered his hand with hers and held it against her cheek for a moment before speaking softly, saying that they were both scarred souls, both people trying to live with guilt. They did not know if they could ever forgive, but perhaps they did not have to carry it alone. And that night, for the first time since Luca died, Dominic Kane did not sleep alone in the darkness. Grace sat beside him until morning came, their hands clasped tightly together like two people drowning, clinging to the last piece of driftwood in a vast and unforgiving sea. The 3rd week brought a ghost from the past that Grace believed she had buried long ago. She was crossing the grand foyer after picking up medication from Dr. Tommy's office when Elena stopped her with a strange expression and said there was a woman at the gate demanding to see her, claiming to be her mother. Grace froze, as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over her head. She said nothing for a long moment before asking what the woman looked like. Elena described someone nearly 60 years old, faded, dyed blonde hair, cheap clothing, trying unsuccessfully to look elegant, and the unmistakable signs of alcohol. Grace closed her eyes and released a long breath, telling Elena to bring the woman to the small sitting room and that she would come down immediately. When Grace entered the sitting room, Sarah Bennett was standing in the center, greedily examining the expensive paintings on the walls. The woman turned at the sound of the door, and her face spread into a smile. Grace remembered all too well, the smile she used whenever she wanted something. Sarah stepped forward and opened her arms as if to embrace her daughter, saying, "My darling Grace, I have been searching for you for so many years, and I finally found you." Grace stepped back, avoiding the embrace, and asked in a voice cold as ice what she wanted. Sarah lowered her arms, but the smile never faded, saying, "Why are you so cold to your mother? I just wanted to see you, to make things right after all these years apart." Grace let out a bitter laugh and asked whether abandoning an 8-year-old child with a violent alcoholic father was what she called being apart, whether leaving with a lover without a backward glance, without a single call or letter for 19 years, counted as distance, and now she wanted to make things right. Sarah sighed as if Grace were being unfair, saying she had been in a difficult situation and had no choice, and that Grace would not understand. Then her tone softened, and she said that now she was here, she saw that Grace was working for a very wealthy family, and perhaps Grace could help her a little. Grace asked how much. Sarah blinked with feigned surprise and asked what she meant. Grace said, "Tell me how much money you want. Say it plainly. You are here for money, not motherly love." Sarah dropped the act and said $50,000. That she owed some dangerous people because of gambling and needed the money urgently. Grace laughed hollowly and said she owed $200,000 herself and was living on a nurse's salary, that she did not have $50,000 for her. Sarah narrowed her eyes and her voice sharpened, saying, "Perhaps you do not, but your employer does." And she happened to know that a few journalists would be very interested in a story about a poor nurse living in the mansion of the most notorious mafia boss in New York, adding that she wondered what the press might write about Grace's relationship with Dominic Kane. Grace felt heat rush to her face as she stepped closer and asked with a trembling voice whether Sarah was threatening her. Sarah smiled and said it was not a threat, merely a proposal, 50,000, and she would disappear from Grace's life forever. Suddenly, a low, ice-cold voice sounded from the doorway, asking who was threatening whom here. Both Grace and Sarah turned to see Dominic standing in the threshold, leaning against the frame with a calm expression, while his black eyes radiated the dangerous light Grace had learned to recognize. He stepped into the room, each movement slow and deliberate, like a panther advancing on its prey, stopping in front of Sarah and looking down at her with such coldness that the air itself seemed to freeze. He said that he was Dominic Kane, and that he had heard her mention selling information to the press, tilting his head and asking whether she knew what happened to people who threatened his family. Sarah went pale and stammered that Grace was not his family. Dominic glanced briefly at Grace before returning his gaze to Sarah and saying that she was in his house, under his protection, which made her his, and that anyone who threatened what was his would face consequences beyond imagination. He stepped closer and said quietly that she had 30 seconds to leave, and if he heard her name anywhere near Grace or anywhere near a newspaper, he would ensure that the people she owed money to would find her before he did. Sarah did not need to hear more. She turned and fled the room, the sound of her heels echoing down the hallway until they faded away. When the door closed, Grace stood there, unable to speak, wanting to thank Dominic but finding her throat locked tight. All the emotions she had buried for years surged at once, the pain of a child abandoned by her mother, the fury of a young woman forced to survive alone, the shame of seeing her mother reduced to a blackmailer. She turned away so Dominic would not see her cry, but it was too late. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she could not stop them. She murmured an apology and tried to leave, but Dominic caught her wrist and stopped her. He said nothing, offered no hollow comfort. He simply stood there holding her wrist, so she would know she was not alone, and Grace, who had not allowed herself to cry in front of anyone since Marcus died, finally let the tears fall freely in the silent room as darkness settled beyond the windows. Dominic led Grace back to the small room at the end of the 4th-floor corridor, saying nothing, only placing a hand lightly at her back and guiding her step by step as if afraid she might fall. And when they entered the room, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and bowed her head, her shoulders trembling with the sobs she tried desperately to contain. Dominic lingered by the door for a moment as if uncertain what to do. A man who ruled the East Coast, who could command hundreds with a word and decide the fate of entire criminal empires. Yet standing before a woman who was crying, he was utterly helpless. He did not know how to comfort anyone, could not remember the last time he had held another human being, had no soft words ready for moments like this, and yet he could not bring himself to leave. Finally, he stepped into the room and sat beside Grace on the edge of the bed. Not too close, not too far, just close enough for her to know he was there. He said nothing, did not touch her, did not offer hollow reassurances that everything would be fine. He simply sat in silence with his hands resting on his knees and his gaze fixed straight ahead. Grace cried for a long time, the choking sobs slowly turning into quiet tears and then into stillness. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and said in a hoarse voice that she was sorry for letting him see her like this. Dominic did not look at her when he replied that there was nothing to apologize for. Grace let out a faint, bitter laugh and said that she had not seen her mother in 19 years. 19 years of wondering where she was, whether she was alive, whether she ever thought about her. Nights as a child spent lying in the dark listening to her drunken father smash things and praying that her mother would come back and take her away. But she never did. And now that she had appeared, it was not because she missed her, not because she wanted to make things right, but because she wanted money. Dominic remained silent. Listening, Grace went on to say that the most painful part was not the abandonment. She had learned to live with that long ago. The most painful part was realizing that for 19 years, she had still hoped, still kept a small corner of her heart believing that maybe her mother had a reason, that maybe one day she would return and explain everything. And today that small corner had been completely crushed. She turned to Dominic and asked whether she was foolish for hoping after all these years. Dominic finally turned to look at her, his black eyes no longer cold as usual, but holding something softer, something Grace did not dare name. He said no. She was not foolish. She was human, and humans always hope, even when they know hope will hurt them. He added that every morning he still hoped to wake up and see Luca standing in the doorway, telling him it had all been a long nightmare. He knew it would never happen, but he still hoped. Perhaps that was what separated humans from monsters. Grace looked at him, the man the world called the devil. And for the first time she saw him clearly. Not a ruthless mafia boss, not a difficult patient who refused to be saved, but a lonely man trying to live with pain too large for a single heart. She did not think when she rested her head against his shoulder. She was simply tired. Tired of being strong. Tired of being alone. Tired of everything. And his shoulder was there, solid and warm, even though the fever had broken days earlier. Dominic stiffened for a moment when he felt her head against him, then slowly, awkwardly, like someone who had forgotten how to do this long ago, he lifted his hand and placed it gently in her hair. They sat like that in silence for a long time. No words needed, no explanations required, just two scarred souls finding a small measure of peace beside each other in a quiet room, while darkness fully settled beyond the window. And in that moment the distance between nurse and patient, between a poor woman and a feared mafia kingpin, narrowed until there was nothing left but shared breath and two hearts beating in the same fragile rhythm. 1 week after the incident with Sarah, everything in the Kane estate seemed to return to normal, or at least to what passed for normal in this place. Dominic's wound had healed significantly thanks to Grace's patient care and his reluctant cooperation. He remained demanding and full of unreasonable rules, yet he no longer knocked medication trays to the floor, and from time to time, Grace caught him looking at her with an expression she did not dare interpret. That afternoon, Dr. Tommy called to say that several specialized medications needed for the next stage of recovery had arrived at their usual pharmacy, and Grace volunteered to pick them up because she needed to step outside and breathe fresh air after days without leaving the estate. Marco offered to go with her, but Grace refused, saying she would only be gone briefly, and the pharmacy was just a 15-minute walk away. She did not want a bodyguard trailing her as if she were someone important. Marco reluctantly agreed, but told her to call immediately if anything felt wrong. Grace stepped outside and welcomed the late afternoon sunlight and the cool New York autumn air. She walked familiar streets, collected the medication, and on her way back decided to take a shortcut through an alley to save time. It was a mistake. She had barely gone a few meters in when two figures appeared ahead, blocking her path. One, a large man with a scarred face, and the other smaller, but with eyes just as dangerous. Grace turned to see a third man, blocking the alley entrance behind her. She was surrounded. The scarred man stepped forward and said, in a thick European accent, that she was Kane's little nurse. Wasn't she? That someone had sent their regards. Grace backed up until her shoulders met cold brick and asked who had sent regards, even though she already knew. The man smiled and said a very beautiful blonde lady. She said to teach this little girl a lesson about knowing her place. Natasha. Grace was not surprised, but that did nothing to ease the fear swelling in her chest. She considered screaming, but the alley was deserted and she doubted anyone would come. She thought about running, but they were faster and more numerous, so she did the only thing she could do. She fought. When the scarred man reached for her, Grace swung the heavy bag of medication into his face and kicked hard between his legs. He doubled over and she tried to run, but the second man grabbed her hair and yanked her back. She screamed in pain and spun to claw at his face. He struck her across the face, her ears ringing and the taste of blood filling her mouth. She fell to the ground but did not stay down. She grabbed a shard of broken glass nearby and drove it into the leg of the man bending toward her. He howled and staggered back. The scarred man straightened, his face flushed with rage. He kicked Grace in the stomach, knocking the breath from her, and said the little bitch had guts, which only made him want to teach her a lesson she would never forget. He seized her hair, forced her head back, and raised his fist. Grace closed her eyes and waited for the blow, but it never came. Instead, she heard the sound of bone snapping, followed by a scream of agony. She opened her eyes to see Marco standing there, one hand gripping the scarred man's broken wrist, the other holding a sleek black gun aimed at the remaining two. Marco said in a voice colder than ice that they had 10 seconds to disappear before he put a bullet through each of their heads. The two men exchanged a glance and fled. Marco released the scarred man, who collapsed to the ground, clutching his wrist and groaning. Marco kicked him in the face, knocking him unconscious, then turned to Grace, crouched, and gently helped her up, asking if she was all right. Grace nodded, even though her face was swelling and her abdomen felt as if it were being torn apart. She whispered, "Thank you," and Marco supported her, nearly carrying her because her legs shook too badly to hold her weight. When they reached the estate, Dominic was standing at the entrance, as if he already knew something had happened. When he saw Grace bruised and bloodied in Marco's arms, his black eyes turned to ice. He did not shout or rage or show any emotion at all, but his silence was more terrifying than any outburst. He stepped forward and gently took Grace from Marco, asking quietly who had done this. Marco told him what he knew, about the 3 men, and about their words that a blonde lady had sent her regards. Dominic nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Grace's injured face. He told Marco to take her to her room and call Tommy immediately. Then he turned and walked into his office, closing the door behind him. Grace heard him on the phone, and though she could not make out every word, she recognized his voice, calm, measured, and lethal enough to send a chill through her. Even though she knew his fury was not directed at her, she heard him say a name, Viktor Volkov, then say that his daughter had laid hands on someone who belonged to him. And if it happened again, the alliance Viktor wanted would end along with Natasha's life. He did not shout or make dramatic threats. He spoke as if discussing the weather, and that calmness was the most frightening thing of all. When the call ended, Dominic left his office and went straight to Grace's room where Tommy was examining her injuries. He stood in the doorway, looking at her with eyes she could not read, and Grace found herself wondering whether she should be afraid of this man, or whether she had been afraid for a long time already, just not for the reasons everyone else believed. Dr. Tommy worked in silence, stitching the cut on Grace's forehead and checking for any broken ribs, and in the end he concluded that she was badly bruised across her face and abdomen, but had no internal injuries and would be fine with a few days of rest. He left pain medication and instructions, and then departed, leaving Dominic and Grace alone in the small room. Dominic remained standing in the doorway, not having spoken a single word since the call with Viktor Volkov ended. Grace sat on the bed with her face swollen and her body aching. Yet her mind kept circling the same question over and over. She looked up and asked Dominic what he had called her earlier when speaking to her mother. Dominic did not answer right away, his jaw tightening. Grace went on, saying that he had called her his, and that she had heard him use the same words on the phone with Viktor, asking what that meant. Dominic stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, staring out into the darkness that had fully settled outside. A long silence stretched between them, and then he said that he did not know. Grace asked what he did not know. Dominic turned back to her, and for the first time since they had met, she saw him as an ordinary man, not a mafia king, not the devil people feared, but a man genuinely confused by his own emotions. He said he did not know why he had said it, that when he heard Marco describe the attack, when he saw her bruised face and knew who was behind it, he felt something he had not felt in 3 years. He felt anger, not the cold, controlled rage of a boss whose authority had been challenged, but a burning fury that set his chest on fire. He wanted to find Natasha and make her pay with his own hands, wanted to protect Grace from anyone who dared lay a finger on her, and the words "my person" had simply come out as if they were the most obvious truth in the world. Dominic moved closer to the bed where Grace was sitting, bent down until their eyes were level, and spoke softly, saying that he did not know what this meant, that he did not know how to love someone, did not know whether he was still capable of loving anyone after Luca, did not know whether he had the right to love when his hands were stained with blood and his soul heavy with guilt, but he knew that when he thought of her being hurt, his heart ached as if the knife had gone into him instead. He knew that every morning when he woke, the first thing he thought about was whether she had slept well, and how she would smile at him while changing his bandages. He knew that in this dark house, she was the only light he did not want to lose. He said that he did not know whether this was love, but if he had to name the feeling, he had no other word for it. Grace looked at him, her gray blue eyes filling with tears not from physical pain but from something far deeper. She lifted her hand and touched his face, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the hard lines of a face the world called the devil, but that she saw only as a lonely man, learning how to feel again. She said that she did not know either, that she still loved Marcus, still missed him every day, still felt guilty whenever her heart beat faster because of Dominic, but she also knew that when those men attacked her, the name she cried out in her mind was not Marcus but Dominic, and that frightened her more than any blow ever could. Dominic closed his hand around hers and held it, saying nothing more because nothing more was needed, and they sat there in silence, hand in hand, two broken hearts, learning how to beat in the same rhythm. And though neither of them knew what the future would hold, though their world was still filled with darkness and danger, in that moment they had each other, and that, for now, was enough. 1 month had passed since the attack in the alley. The bruises on Grace's face had faded, leaving only a small scar on her forehead that she hid beneath her hair. Dominic's wound had also healed completely, Dr. Tommy declaring that he no longer required regular medical care, and that was precisely the problem. Grace stood in Dominic's room that afternoon, late autumn sunlight slipping through a narrow opening in the curtains that she had been allowed to open for the first time. She had just changed the bandage for the final time, and was packing her medical tools back into their case, when she said that the wound had healed fully, and he no longer needed a nurse. Dominic sat in the armchair beside the cold fireplace, a book in his hands that he was not truly reading. He looked up at her but said nothing. Grace went on to say that she should begin looking for a new position, and that she had contacted several hospitals in Brooklyn. One of them needed an experienced nurse, and could take her the following week. Dominic remained silent, his black eyes never leaving her. Grace felt a sharp ache in her chest as she spoke, but she knew she had to. She could not stay here forever, could not continue pretending she was only a nurse, when they both knew that was no longer true. She needed distance to think, to understand what she was feeling, to decide whether she could allow herself to love again. She said she would leave at the end of the week and thanked him for giving her the job, for helping pay part of her debt when she discovered he had quietly settled $50,000 of what she owed, for protecting her from her mother and from Natasha. She said she would never forget what he had done for her. Dominic set the book down and stood. He stepped in front of Grace and looked down at her with eyes she still could not read, despite having been at his side for more than a month. He said no. Grace blinked and asked no to what. Dominic said she was not going anywhere. She was staying. Grace opened her mouth to argue, but Dominic continued, saying that the wound on his shoulder had healed, but the wound in his chest had not. That for 3 years, he had lived like a walking corpse, waking each day only to wait for night, counting hours just to drink himself numb and forget, longing for death to come and end everything. And then she had appeared with taped shoes, a mouth that knew no fear, and gray-blue eyes that saw straight through him as no one ever had. She did not run when he tried to drive her away, did not cry when he tried to wound her, did not give up when he did everything possible to make her leave. She stayed, and because she stayed, he began to want to live again. Dominic lifted his hand and touched Grace's face, his thumb brushing lightly over the small scar on her forehead. He said she was the only person who could heal the wound he had carried in his chest for 3 years, that he did not know why and could not explain it, only that when he was with her, he felt as though he could breathe for the first time since Luca died. He asked whether she could stay, not as his nurse but as herself, Grace Bennett, the woman he did not deserve yet selfishly wanted to keep by his side. Grace looked at him, the most powerful man she had ever known, standing before her and asking her to stay with the eyes of a child terrified of being abandoned. She thought of Marcus, of the promise to love him forever, of the guilt that gnawed at her whenever her heart beat faster for another man, and then she thought of what Marcus had said before he died, that he wanted her to be happy, wanted her to keep living, wanted her to find someone to love when he was no longer there. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she spoke a single word. Yes. Dominic froze, as if he had not heard correctly, and asked what she had just said. Grace opened her eyes, her gray-blue gaze shining with tears and a quiet smile, and said she would stay, that this was probably the most reckless decision of her life. But her life had been reckless for a long time already, so a little more madness would not hurt. 2 days after Grace agreed to stay, Elena came to her with a message that Victor Kane wished to see her, Grace had never met Dominic's father, although she knew he lived in the west wing of the estate with a private medical team caring for his worsening heart condition. She followed Elena through long corridors until they stopped before a dark wooden door. Elena knocked, and a weak voice from inside granted permission to enter. Victor Kane's room was completely different from Dominic's, filled with light from large windows, walls covered in family photographs and lacking any trace of gloom. Victor sat in an armchair by the window, a thin man with white silver hair and black eyes identical to his son's yet far gentler. He gestured for Grace to sit in the chair opposite and asked Elena to leave. Once they were alone, Victor studied Grace and said that she was the woman who had made his son want to live again. Grace did not know how to respond and remained silent. Victor smiled faintly and said he had heard Elena speak of her, of how she was the only nurse who did not run, how she stayed through the night when Dominic burned with fever, how she had been attacked because of him. He said he had also heard Dominic speak her name in his sleep, and that it was something he had not heard since Luca died. Grace still said nothing. Uncertain where this conversation was leading, Victor sighed and began to tell her that when Dominic was 10 years old, his mother was shot dead in front of him during a hit, that Dominic hid beneath a table and watched his mother fall, blood spilling across the floor, helpless to do anything. And after that day, he never cried again, never spoke of his mother, sealing himself off like a fortress. Victor said he had tried to help his son, but did not know how, that he was a mafia boss, not a good father, that he taught Dominic how to be strong, how to lead, how never to appear weak, but forgot to teach him how to love, and how to let himself be loved. Then when Dominic was 22, he placed the weight of the entire Kane Empire on his shoulders as his own illness began. Dominic carried it all without complaint, and Victor believed things would be fine. Then Luca died, and Victor watched his son collapse inwardly. While he could do nothing, Victor looked straight into Grace's eyes and said that he was dying, and he knew it. The doctors said he had a few months, perhaps less, and the only thing he wanted before closing his eyes was to see his son live, truly live, not merely exist as he had for the past 3 years. He said he had reviewed Grace's file, knew what she had endured, knew how strong she was to survive it all, and he begged her, an old dying father begging her, not to abandon his son. Dominic needed her, even though he would never admit it, because he was too proud and too afraid to acknowledge that he needed anyone. But Victor was his father. He saw the look in his son's eyes when he spoke of her, and he knew. Grace felt tears rise as she looked at the frail old man pleading for his child. She took Victor's hand and said she could not promise to stay forever because she did not know what the future held, but she promised she would not leave when Dominic needed her, and that she would do everything she could to help him heal. Victor squeezed her hand and smiled, his black eyes shining with tears, and said that was enough, and he thanked her. 2 weeks after the conversation with Victor, hell descended upon the Kane estate at midnight. Grace was in Dominic's room, the two of them talking by the fireplace as had become their quiet nightly ritual. When the first gunshot rang out from below, Dominic sprang to his feet, 14 years of mafia instinct instantly telling him exactly what was happening. He yanked Grace out of her chair and shoved her toward the large wardrobe in the corner of the room, ordering her to hide inside and not come out no matter what happened. Grace wanted to argue, but the look in Dominic's eyes left no room for resistance. He pulled a gun from the desk drawer and moved toward the door. The gunfire drew closer. Screams, shattering glass, and pounding footsteps echoing through the estate. Grace crouched inside the wardrobe, her heart hammering wildly as she prayed Dominic would survive. Then the bedroom door was kicked open, and she heard gunshots explode inside the room itself. She could not endure it any longer and burst out of the wardrobe to see Dominic standing in the center of the room, 2 men dressed in black, lying motionless on the floor, but a third man stood in the doorway with a gun aimed straight at Dominic. Grace screamed his name just as the shot rang out. Everything happened in an instant. Dominic turned at the sound of her voice and saw the man redirecting his aim toward Grace, and without thinking, driven by pure instinct, he lunged for her and shielded her with his body as the bullet flew. Grace heard the gunshot, felt Dominic crash into her, and both of them fell to the floor. Another shot rang out, and she heard someone collapse. She looked up to see Marco standing in the doorway, smoke still curling from the barrel of his gun. The third man crumpled lifeless at his feet. Then Grace felt something warm and wet on her hands and looked down to see blood. Dominic's blood. He lay on the floor, clutching his abdomen where the bullet had torn through, his face ashen and slick with sweat. Grace panicked, tore her shirt and pressed it hard against the wound to stop the bleeding, calling his name over and over. Dominic looked at her with eyes already beginning to dim, and whispered that she had to go, had to hide, that more were coming. Grace shook her head, tears streaming down her face, telling him she was not going anywhere, that she would not leave him. Dominic tried to push her away but had no strength left, telling her she had to live, that he could not lose another person, that he could not survive it if she died because of him. Grace gripped his hand tightly and told him she had said it before, that she was not afraid of death, that she had been ready to die for a long time, that the only thing she feared was losing him, just as she had found him. Dominic stared at her, his black eyes shining with something Grace had never seen before, and said that he was afraid, that for the first time in 3 years he was afraid to die because he did not want to leave her. He told her that he loved her madly, loved her so much he would take 10 bullets if it meant she was safe, that he did not know when it happened or why, only that she had become the sole reason he wanted to wake up every morning. Grace cried and laughed at the same time, bent down and kissed his forehead, telling him she loved him too, loved the devil the whole world feared, loved the broken man bleeding in her arms, telling him he was not allowed to die, not after she had just admitted this. Footsteps thundered in the hallway, and Marco shouted that the ambulance was coming and to hold on a little longer. Grace pressed harder against the wound, refusing to let the blood spill further, repeating his name and telling him to look at her, not to close his eyes, to stay with her. Dominic squeezed her hand and whispered that he was not going anywhere, that he had waited 3 years to find her, and he would not let a bullet tear him away from her. Then the medical team rushed in, and Grace was forced to release his hand so they could work. She stood there with blood-soaked hands, watching them lift Dominic onto a stretcher and rush him away. She ran after them to the ambulance, and did not let go of his hand the entire ride to the hospital, continuously telling him that she was there and that she was not going anywhere. Dominic woke 3 days later in the intensive care unit of the finest private hospital in New York, and the first thing he saw was Grace slumped asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand tightly wrapped around his as if she feared he would disappear the moment she let go. She looked utterly exhausted, with dark shadows beneath her eyes and hair in complete disarray. Yet to Dominic she had never looked more beautiful. He moved slightly, and Grace woke instantly, and when she saw his eyes open and looking at her she broke down, tears streaming down her cheeks without bothering to wipe them away. She said he had been unconscious for 3 days, and she thought she was going to lose him. Dominic smiled weakly and told her he had promised he was not going anywhere, and Dominic Kane never broke a promise. Grace laughed through her tears and called him an idiot. In the days that followed, Dominic slowly recovered in the hospital with Grace never leaving his side. Marco came to report that the gang responsible for the attack was a new group from Miami testing the Kane family, and they had been dealt with. Natasha Volkov had also been sent back to Russia by her father after the attack on Grace, and would never appear in New York again. Everything had been resolved, but Dominic no longer felt the satisfaction he once would have. One afternoon when they were alone in the hospital room, Dominic took Grace's hand and said he wanted to change. Grace asked how. Dominic said he could not abandon the Kane family because it was his responsibility, but he could change the way it operated. He wanted to gradually move toward legitimate business and leave behind the things that had made Luca hate this family. And he wanted to build a free clinic in the poorest part of New York, where Luca had once worked, where people without money could still receive the medical care they deserved. He wanted to name it the Luca Kane Clinic. Grace looked at him with tears shining in her eyes and asked why. Dominic said because Luca wanted to save people and he had taken that chance away from his brother. He could not bring Luca back, but he could continue the work his brother had wanted to do. He said it was not redemption because nothing could redeem his sins, but it was how he chose to live, how he chose to turn pain into something meaningful instead of letting it keep destroying him. Grace said nothing and simply leaned down to kiss him. Their first kiss, gentle and tender, carrying the salt of tears and the sweetness of hope. When she pulled back, Dominic looked at her and said he loved her. Grace smiled and replied that she knew, and that she loved him too, even though he was an idiot who had nearly died taking a bullet for her. 2 weeks after Dominic was discharged, he took Grace to a place he had not brought anyone to in 3 years, the private Kane family cemetery where Luca rested. They stood before the white marble grave engraved with the name Luca Kane and the words, "He lived to save others." Dominic stood in silence for a long time, and then knelt down and began to speak. He told Luca he was sorry. Sorry for not saving him. Sorry for spending 3 years destroying himself instead of living in a way worthy of what Luca wanted. He introduced Grace to Luca, saying she was the woman who saved him when he did not want to be saved, the woman who made him want to live again. He promised Luca that from now on he would live, he would love, he would build the clinic in Luca's name, and he would do the things Luca had wanted to do. Grace knelt beside Dominic and placed a bouquet of flowers on the grave. She told Luca she would take care of his brother, and promised she would not let him lose himself again. She thanked Luca for being the reason Dominic still believed in goodness, despite a life filled with darkness. 3 months later, Dominic proposed to Grace on the balcony of the Kane estate beneath the setting sun. She said yes, and they were married a month later in a small ceremony with only those closest to them present. Victor Kane sat in a wheelchair in the front row, tears running down his aged face as he watched his son finally find happiness. 1 week after the wedding, Victor passed away in his sleep with a smile on his lips. Dominic cried for the first time since Luca died, and Grace held him all night. At the funeral, Dominic stood before everyone and said his father was not a perfect man, that he had made many mistakes and done many terrible things, but he had loved his children in the only way he knew how, and the final gift he left behind was Grace, the woman who saved Dominic from himself. He thanked his father for never giving up on him, even when he had given up on himself, and he promised to live a life worthy of the sacrifice of both his father and his brother. 1 year after Victor passed away, the Luca Kane Clinic officially opened in the Bronx, one of the poorest areas of New York, a 3-story building with a bright glass facade rising among worn streets like a lighthouse cutting through darkness. Inside were modern examination rooms, advanced medical equipment, and teams of volunteer doctors and nurses ready to care for anyone in need, regardless of their ability to pay. On the wall of the main lobby hung a portrait of Luca Kane with a gentle smile, and the words beneath it reading, "Healing begins with compassion." Hundreds of people attended the opening ceremony, from local residents to city officials, and even familiar faces from the underworld who came to pay their respects. Dominic stood on the stage in a black suit, Grace beside him in a pale blue dress, their hands tightly intertwined. Dominic took the microphone and said that this clinic existed because of a younger brother who had spent his entire life dreaming of it. Luca had wanted a place where the poorest and most forgotten people could be treated with dignity and love. He could not complete that dream, but Luca's dream would live on through this place. Dominic looked at Grace and continued that the clinic also existed because of a woman who had taught him that healing was not only about bandaging wounds but about touching the heart, not only about medicine but about presence, not only about saving lives but about giving people a reason to live. His wife, Grace Kane, the woman who saved him when he did not want to be saved. Applause thundered through the hall. Grace stepped forward to speak, but the moment she opened her mouth, the room began to spin. The lights grew too bright, the sounds distant, and her legs gave way. She swayed, and Dominic caught her instantly before she fell, shouting for a doctor as he carried her off the stage, his face drained of color with fear. Dr. Tommy rushed in from backstage and quickly examined Grace, asking a few questions, checking her pulse and blood pressure, then looking at her with a strange expression. He asked when her last cycle had been. Grace froze as her mind raced, and she realized she was nearly 2 months late. She had been too busy preparing for the clinic opening and caring for Dominic after Victor's death to notice. Tommy smiled and said he was fairly certain, but tests would confirm it. However, in his experience, she was pregnant. Grace looked at Tommy, then at Dominic, then back at Tommy, and whispered what she was carrying. Tommy laughed softly and said, "A baby. You are going to be a mother." Dominic stood frozen like a statue, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, unable to speak. Grace looked at him and said, "Did you hear that? You are going to be a father." Dominic stared at her, then at her stomach, then back at her face, stammering, "A father. I am going to be a father." Grace nodded with tears streaming down her smiling face and said, "Yes, you are going to be a father." Dominic stood still for 1 second, and then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the floor. Tommy sighed and said, "Someone get water and salt." The boss just fainted. The hall went silent for a heartbeat, and then erupted in laughter and applause. Elena ran in with a bottle of water while Marco stood beside his boss, unsure whether to worry or laugh. Grace laughed until tears poured down her face as she sat beside Dominic and gently patted his cheek, telling him to wake up, "You idiot. I am your nurse, and you are not allowed to faint on my shift." Dominic slowly opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was Grace's face, looking down at him with the brightest smile he had ever seen. He asked, "Did I faint?" Grace nodded and said yes, in front of about 300 people, and someone definitely filmed it. Dominic groaned and covered his face, saying he would never survive this. Grace pulled his hand away and told him he would survive, and he would live very well, because he was about to become a father, and their child needed a strong father, not one who fainted at surprise news. Dominic looked at her and suddenly laughed, a real laugh from deep in his chest, a laugh Grace had never heard before. He sat up and pulled her into a tight embrace right there on the stage in front of everyone, whispering, thank you for everything." That evening, after the ceremony ended and all the guests had left, Dominic and Grace stood on the balcony of the Kane estate, looking out over the city lights below. Dominic stood behind her with his arms around her waist, one hand resting gently on her stomach, where a small life was growing. Grace leaned back against his chest and said she still could not believe it. She had arrived here with broken shoes and $200,000 in debt, thinking she would care for a difficult patient for a few weeks and leave. And now she stood here in the arms of a husband who loved her, carrying their child, with a future she had never dared to dream of. Dominic kissed her hair and said he could not believe it either. 3 years ago he wanted to die, believing he did not deserve to live or be loved. Then a small nurse with a fearless mouth and eyes that saw through everything walked into his room and refused to leave, no matter how hard he tried to drive her away. She stayed, and because she stayed, he was standing here, alive, in love, waiting for their first child. Grace turned in his arms and asked if he was afraid of being a father, afraid of responsibility. Dominic nodded honestly and said he was terrified. He did not know how to be a father, had no good example to follow, did not know if he could protect their child from the dangerous world he lived in. But he also knew he would do anything, sacrifice everything, so their child could grow up loved, never feeling alone or afraid as he once had. Grace smiled and said they would learn to be parents together, make mistakes together, and love their child together. She said she was afraid too, but not when he was beside her. They stood in silence for a long while, watching the first star appear in the night sky. Grace thought of everything that had happened. The girl who slept in her car with nothing left to lose had found a family. The devil feared by the world had found his heart. 2 broken people had healed each other and would now bring that healing to others through the clinic bearing Luca's name. Their story did not end here but was only beginning, because true love is not a destination but a journey, not a happy ending but the beginning of all other happiness. This story teaches us that no one is beyond saving, no wound too deep to be healed, and sometimes the most wounded souls are the ones capable of loving most fiercely. It reminds us that true strength lies not in hiding pain, but in daring to open one's heart, daring to trust, daring to love again after being hurt. And most importantly, it shows us that death is not redemption. Living is. Living and turning pain into something meaningful, living and loving those around us, living and leaving kindness behind in this world. If you are carrying an unhealed wound, remember that you are not alone, and somewhere out there is someone who will see you, understand you, and love you exactly as you are. And what about you? If you were Grace, would you dare stay and care for the devil, or would you run like the 23 nurses before her? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear what your heart feels about this story. Have you ever met someone you thought could never change, but who surprised you in the end? Have you ever been the one who stayed when everyone else left? Tell us your story. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love, so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment, wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.